Bam. This is John Sullivan. You're watching the Break It Down show. Say that.
Okay, this is John Sullivan. You're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, cool. It's interesting. We have all these modern current events, John, and we tend to lose track of like the chain that leads to these things, and the decisions that were made that didn't work, that weren't followed up on, that weren't provisioned. And so it seems like this is an existential crisis, but these things quite often have been going on for a long time, and they ebb and they flow. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how I don't want to say border security because that's just too limiting, but how our relationship with other nations creates crime either on our side of the border or on their side of the border. I don't know. Let's just get into this whole insurgency that we have to always deal with because there are folks that make a lot of money doing illegal things in our country.
Yeah. The first thing I'd say is that transnational organized crime is not new. And it has been morphing and metastasizing in some ways over the past bunch of years. There's a quote I like to use in my presentations when I teach military officers, senior police, or graduate students. And it's from Martin Van Crevel, the eminent Israeli military historian. And Martin said, and this is from the late 90s when I first started building my portfolio on transnational crime. He basically said, in the future, war will not be waged by armies, but by groups whom we today call terrorists, guerrillas, bandits, and robbers, but who will undoubtedly hit upon more formal titles to describe themselves. And if you think, when I first started looking at this, we were in a transition from work domestically, from right-wing extremism. Think of like the 1995 bombing of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, and which was brought an interest in terrorism again. There had been the growth of the militia movement during that period, a bunch of things, around that period of time, Ruby Ridge and, the Branch Davidians and that siege, which didn't work too well. But there was also, and this is going to hark back to something I want to culminate in the briefing. I'll say it now and hopefully I'll remember to say it later, is we tend to look at national security threats, domestic and international, as separate enterprises when they're often linked. We tend to look at them as one threat at a time. So we're working domestic terrorism, and that's a threat. Meanwhile, you get an international threat, a cult that decides to weaponize their own artisanal sarin and attack the Tokyo subway.
Artisanal.
And then we move into this large evolution of let's deal with WMD terrorism, and I did a lot of work on that. And then we see the East Africa bombings, and Al Qaeda comes to mind, and then ultimately, in 2001, Al Qaeda becomes the main game, and then Al Qaeda morphs, metastasizes. You see ISIS, so ISIS becomes a big thing. There's always been a stream. So the Al Qaeda attack on the World Trade Center, 9/11, had an antecedent. The 1993 attack on the World Trade Center from the blind sheikh, who, by the way, lived in an apartment across the street from the Grove Path Station in Jersey City, on top of a Chinese restaurant. And there was a small, what some might call a mosque in a box, a small congregation that was in an area. So we tend to look at things as separate. They're actually not. So kind of what am I going to try to talk about in the next few minutes? I'm going to try to talk about converging threats, how what appear to be individual threat streams come together. I'm going to lay out a foundation of what criminal insurgency looks like, what crime wars are, and how they're different from high-intensity crime. I'll talk a little bit about how you categorize conflict. I'll talk about hybrid warfare and hybrid threats because that coexists with organized crime. And I think I may talk a bit about strategic crime, how some foreign intelligence services, some nations use organized crime as a lever to amplify their capacity. And then talk about what's really shocking to many people right now, looking at the current news, how certain groups like pirates, militias, cartels, and mafias become important. And like Haiti, in my mind, is the worst case. So,
Hmm.
what does this mean? It means I'll start with the definition of what criminal insurgency is. Criminal insurgency is the use of violence by organized criminal enterprises to create conditions that allow them to operate effectively, generally to create profit. Now, people will tell you that criminals have no political aspirations. That is often true, but it is not always true. That's a
Hmm.
paradigm of the post-Westphalian nation state. But if you were to ask Caesar, Julius Caesar, or Augustus Caesar, what they thought about brigands and pirates,
Yeah.
they would tell you that they had challenges to their imperial, that version of the state that existed then, or the pre-state, to their imperial well-being. So these aren't new. Criminals, brigands have been repeated actors on the global stage over time. We now call them, we call criminals. We talk about gangs, street gangs, drug cartels, mafias. There's no universal agreement upon how you define them, where they go. But let's say that they could become violent non-state actors, or I like to use the term when they become a true armed threat to the state, criminal armed groups. So how could criminal insurgency present itself? It normally presents itself as a battle for the parallel state. So if you were to agree that organized crime has always coexisted with the state, in fact, I'd point out that state formation theory, think of Charles Tilly, sociologist who did a lot of work on state formation and state transition. The modern nation state that emerges after the Treaty of Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia, has its antecedents in roving bands, in brigands, and organized crime and taxation. So what do organized crime groups do that gives them a parallel capacity of varying degrees with the state? Well, they collect taxes. They call it extortion, but it's basically collecting taxes. And obviously that has political dimensions at times. So there's a battle for the parallel state. In most places, organized crime is weak, the state is strong. Often state coexists with organized crime, with the Yakuza in Japan, the mafias of various types of mafias in Italy, and obviously parts of the United States. The next level of what could be viewed as a criminal insurgency or a variety of crime war is a local insurgency. So think a crime-ridden neighborhood. Think of what some people may call no-go zones, or derisively the ghetto, or the barrio, places where organized crime has a presence. It's strong. They dominate local life, but only within a small sphere. And sometimes there's battles for who controls that. The third level, which is what I think I would argue we're seeing in places like Mexico, Brazil, El Salvador, Latin America in general, is when the organized crime can no longer coexist effectively with the state, so therefore it confronts the state. And that's what I think you see happening in places like Mexico. So Tamaulipas, which Mexico is a federal republic, so Tamaulipas is one area where organized crime is extremely strong. Chihuahua, for a period of time, Ciudad Juarez on the border with El Paso, was the most violent city on the planet. At times, Tijuana, which coexists across the border from San Diego in California, has been violent as well. So those are places where the cartels confront the state. In Brazil, large gangs, and I call them prison street gang complexes, because the two biggest gangs in Brazil, and there are dozens, but the PCC, the Primeiro Comando da Capital, or the First Capital Command, and their rival at the current time, the Red Command, or Comando Vermelho, they battle with each other. They battle inside the prisons and on the street. They conduct terrorist attacks on the street. PCC is notable for doing that. And they attack the police. The police in Brazil decided to create vigilante groups, militias, to combat the gangs. And what becomes another recurring theme is those police militias or those informal militias found that organized crime was more lucrative than order or the rule of law. And they eventually became just straight competitors with the other criminal enterprises in that area. So you see that kind of a mix. So, and then the last example, and this is what people we were discussing before we went on the show, what people on social media find confusing is the situation in Haiti, where gangs are now overt political actors. For example, Jimmy Cherizier goes by the moniker of Barbecue because his mother once created great barbecue in the neighborhood, and he was a cop. So that interesting thing. He's not an unskilled thug who just got there. And he had an alliance of 9 major gangs called the G9, or group of 9, and just more than 9 now. He's directly and has been for a number of years directly challenging the state. In fact, back a few years ago, Dr. Robert Bunker and I wrote a strategic note over at Small Wars Journal, El Centro, where we do basically monitor ongoing criminal armed groups and organized crime conflict. We pointed out that he was starting to exhibit the examples of what might become a full-blown criminal insurgency of the level where the state implodes, and that's where we are in Haiti now. So a big, broad area. So what?
Yeah.
And this there's more to it. But so what do most people think of gangs? Well, gangs have been prevalent throughout man, but in the United States example, we start to think of Frederick Thrasher with the Chicago gang studies back in 1927. Most cops only hear that in the police academy, and then they never hear it again. Then we start thinking of groups in the 1980s, like the LA gangs, like the Crips and the Bloods. Obviously, in the 80s, when crack cocaine became a global or a national enterprise, not now it's become global, they became important. But there's always been another layer of gangs there, like the Serrano gangs or the Latino or Mexican gangs that are linked to the Mexican mafia, a prison gang, often called MA because of the letter of the alphabet, or in Spanish, the Maras, Mara Salvatrucha, which originates in the MacArthur Park, Pico Union area of Los Angeles.
Right.
And they're not U.S. nationals. But kids that had never lived anywhere else in their memory, they get deported as criminal aliens back to El Salvador. And then you get a second order cascading effect where they're more sophisticated than the pandillas, the local gangs in El Salvador. They love Los Angeles. They think they're from Los Angeles. They are. So they decide to go back, going back and forth and getting deported back and forth. They learn how to negotiate the informal pathways of travel, and then they take that skill and use it to help in human trafficking and help in drug trafficking. And then there's others. The Serranos are in LA and in the Southern California prison population, the big group up in the Northern California, you call them Norteños. You have gangs in New York, which now include Crips and Bloods, and then they add Latin Kings and Trinitarios and Asian gangs. Let me come back to that later when we talk a little bit about the illicit cannabis trade, become vitally important. Texas has its own gang ecosystem, including Barrio Azteca, which starts as a prison gang in Texas, primarily from El Paso. They decide Juarez is right across the border. Back in the day, you could take an intercity trolley car across the border. Now the border is tight. You have to, negotiate a true border frontier crossing. In the old days, you just walked across. They create a branch down in Juarez, and the two interact. Then, this is a very interesting caper, the Barrio Azteca links up with corrupt Mexican law enforcement officials, corrupt Mexican military officials, and starts to conduct attacks, to include one notable suicide bombing where they basically capture a guy, kill him, put him in a police uniform, call in a request for assistance. When the ambulance and cops come, they detonate, a car bomb. Very low yield, not as big as what people would call a VBIED, as seen in the Iraqi conflict, but a car bomb nonetheless. So interesting collections of networked enterprises that come together. That network component confounds the issues, makes it really hard. We used to call it the MS-13 links between Los Angeles, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and San Salvador, the bloody triangle, because that command and control, and not like direct command, but networks of influence would create that organization to the point where deputy sheriffs, I'm a retired LA County sheriff's lieutenant, deputy sheriffs that I have worked with over the years on field trips, visits down to San Salvador, would recover lists of the MS-13 sets in Los Angeles, the sub cliques of the gang, listing them by name, and the guys down there in San Salvador are looking at it as models. Crips and Bloods are down in Belize City, for example. So what does all this do? You see these criminal enterprises, sometimes they gain territorial control. They operate in prisons in the street. Putting someone in prison doesn't stop them from having a criminal enterprise. Think of all the mafia movies. Remember that the Camorra, the Naples mafia, was formed in prison. The prison gangs that I mentioned in Brazil have street presence. They permeate the area. They dominate territory on the street. They conduct attacks. Then on and on. The ecosystem that brings these together is a global illicit network of flows. You could call it money and contraband and goods. The Ndrangheta, which is the Calabrian mafia from southern Italy, just south of Naples. We always think of the Sicilian mafia, but the Ndrangheta is the most powerful mafia on the planet. They're divided into clans, and they operate in North America. They operate in Canada. They operate in Brazil. They link with the PCC in Brazil, transport drugs, cocaine primarily, to the second largest market in the planet, which is the European Union. The first largest market is the United States. And on the way, they destabilize everything else. The Chinese triads and tongs, organized crime groups, are engaged in the trade. So it's a multiplayer endeavor. Outlaw motorcycle gangs play in the same mafia relationships with others. So people often say, Mexican organized crime, the cartels are going to take over the United States. Well, not directly. What they're going to do is they're going to create alliances with gangs that are already here, do profit sharing, and then either get captured or they will capture the other group. So when we talk about the border, which is incredibly complicated, and it's the political dialogue clouds a lot of what's actually happening, misrepresents parts and emphasizes parts. For me, and fentanyl is a crisis. There's no doubt about it. And fentanyl is part of the global trade. But for me, the real issues are corruption. How do these groups corrupt the government? Because that's how they become powerful. So,
can I ask a couple of questions? So I want to jump in. You talk about like barbecue, and if you have if you're a warlord of some kind of sort or gang leader, you need a certain mystique, and so it's helpful to have a name like barbecue and then eat human flesh, right? Whether it's true or not,
it may not doesn't matter, or it may be exaggerated.
Yeah, right. And then car bombs, and like if you're in Mosul and your husband gets killed in a fight, you name yourself the mother of war, al Harab or Halab, and so you have these things, these mystiques to protect yourself, protect your people, to create this impact. I wanted to talk about a little bit about that, but also there is that disagreement between, and we're not talking politics, but we are talking policy. So as our policy moves right and left, we still don't ever really get after these problems outside of maybe joint task forces, special forces, and other things, because we do want to be a permissive immigration country, but with that comes these other problems. And so, how do you walk that line between being
Yeah.
a good place to live and being good at immigration versus allowing these, horrible people who at least
Well,
fake like they're eating people for a
well,
living?
the people that are heading the groups, and are they actually eating people? I mean, there are some sacrifice. A lot of that's overemphasized. A lot of what
Right.
they do, you use violence in two ways. Violence can either be instrumental, like I'm going to take you out because you're my challenger. I'm going to
Right.
take you out because often you were sleeping with my girlfriend and I hate you. And then gangs
Right.
fragment. Or it's symbolic. You conduct an attack to demonstrate that you have prowess. How do you deal with that? And I'll try to weave this in a couple of ways. One is the best way to deal with it is through solid intelligence. You have to
Okay.
develop intelligence capabilities that allow you to sense, understand, know the depth of the problem. Intelligence in most modern nation states is divided into domestic intelligence and foreign intelligence with different rules of engagement for collecting
Okay.
information and how you operate. Those protections of civil liberties are vitally important, should be there. And I would argue that they have an effective intelligence organization. You need to have them because one of the things the cartels look to have in an area is develop legitimacy among the public. So while they may come on as a brutal avenger, they often like to send the example that they're the Robin Hood, the social
Right.
bandit who protects the public. So they balance, as all rational actors do. Gangsters are rational actors. And I'm not talking about an individual sociopath or a psychopath or some mix in between who becomes a Sicario and kills people. The ones I've talked to scare me, not because they're violent, but because they don't have the reflection. You look in their eyes and there's like, exudes evil. Are they evil or not? That's
Right.
not my call to make, but they appear that way. Most of these organizations are rational. In fact, they have a large budget. They need to protect their budget. They need to protect their operations. That's why they corrupt public officials. But intelligence is the first level. The second level is you need to have a capability to reinforce the police in fragile states. And police reform is important. And we often rely upon the military to do that. And the military is not actually the best suited enterprise for law enforcement for a whole range of reasons. That's a
Mm.
book. That's a book of the future I need to write. But we need to have the capacity to deal with the level of violence that these enterprises use. For example, we didn't go into the tactics, techniques, and procedures used by these guys, but you see a convergence between anti-personnel landmines being used by like the cartel Luis Gono Generacion in Michoacan, and small UAS or aerial drones, which the cartels, by the way, have weaponized. We're in the process of
Right.
weaponizing before the Ukraine conflict. And now you
Right.
know that all information, once it gets out there in the wild, spreads. So now you see combined arm attacks where they're attacking police and military, army and so Sedena and Semar, the Marines in Mexico, with small UAS and dropping improvised explosive devices on the columns, using sophisticated communications. For example, the Zetas created a microwave relay capability from Tamaulipas on the Texas border all the way down to like Veracruz to be able to
Mm.
communicate among themselves.
That's a
You go
long
to
way.
It's a long way. You think of what it would take to do that for ourselves. It's not trivial. You go to a place like Culiacan, where the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo Guzman's home. The city is wired with closed circuit TV cameras monitored by the gangs. So when the state forces come to engage, the gang sees them. They start to create, narco bloqueos or blockades to, catalyze the response capability, conduct ambushes on the responding police and military coming in using 50 caliber Barrett guns and drones, etc. So for that you need a light infantry capability, a gendarmerie type capability, which, by the way, we in the United States don't have. The French and the Italians are known for that. When we were in the Balkans, we relied upon that capability. But the core capability that you need is what folks at the U.S. Institute of Police would call core policing, what we in the United States call community policing. So you need intelligence, you need a crisis response capability for the criminal armed groups exceed the civil policing response capability, but you need to calibrate it with the rule of law and prosecute, not just conduct military operations, because that brings in a whole issue is this a non-international armed conflict or is this crime? Well, non-international armed conflict is governed by the Geneva Convention's Common Article 3, right, which gives a basic minimal response capability, and it's in customary international law that both sides of the conflict need to adhere to. Do they actually do so in real life all the time? Well, no, that's why you have military lawyers, judges, advocate generals, and war crime tribunals, but that's a standard. So it's just there. I show there's a lot of variation. You need people that understand the tactics. You need people that understand the strategy. You need to link in police and military capability. For me, I think intelligence is the way to do it. And because these are transnational enterprises, you can't do it just within one state. So you have your state penal law. Mexico has penal law. We have penal law. But these guys don't operate just in the U.S. and Mexico. They're down in Brazil, so you need their understanding. Yes, I see the comment. You need a political warfare capability too. Absolutely. Information operations, shaping the environment, cognitive warfare are all part of what we need to do. And
you're talking about professional capacity here, Pete, the counterintelligence agent, shows up. How do the cartels recruit me? I mean, I'm great at war. I'm great at intelligence. So how do they get professional people who are able to do the electronic warfare aspect of it, the counterintelligence part, the psychological operations part? These are real professions.
Well, they are, and they do it in a couple ways. One is, I'll just give you an example. When you talk about transnational organized crime, they have a budget, the capacity of transnational organized crime, all the groups together, a budget twice all the world's militaries combined. And then they operate with global networks and alliances. So corruption itself, think of public corruption, bribery, influence peddling is worth about $1 trillion a year. Then you add the black market on top of that. That's about $1.81 trillion a year. So we're running close to $3 trillion, nearing $3 trillion of capacity. So what do? They hire people. They pay people. They use their own recruitment capabilities. The video, they film their military operations, put them on YouTube, and then put them together with what they call narco corridos in Mexico. Really, catchy, norteño type music, and people like, just like you had the gangster like mystique here in the U.S. There's a certain number of people that think the Italian mafia has a mystique. Well, these guys create mystique. Some of that mystique is showing prowess. Some of it is amplified by violence. But so what they do, they destabilize, they corrupt, they use violence, they create instability. They create alliances with others. I did a study a while back on looking at how Mexican cartels were organized and how they work together. We found the two big players in Mexico are the Sinaloa cartel and the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or the Jalisco cartel. Those two groups are comprised of a network of dozens of subordinate cells, gangs, actors. In between those two poles, there's a small little constellation of professional service providers, people who provide money laundering. And money laundering is one of the ways they get the money. And they create alliance with the Chinese because the Chinese are big at money laundering. So how do they do it? It's, plomo o plato, silver or lead, right? We'll kill you, or we'll pay you off. There's three ways you can deal with organized crime. Organized crime deals with the state. They try to evade the state. They try to co-opt the state, and we'll pay you to do it. And corruption is a major issue. Impunity is when corruption runs rampant and you don't prosecute. Mexico's impunity rate, for example, is well north of 95%. There are several states I think Tamaulipas comes to mind, Guerrero comes to mind, that impunity is about 100%, which means if you murder somebody, the chance of going to, prison is near zero. So how do they do it? You could go on the police radio in Tijuana at night and listen when the cartels are moving and the police come. Hear them calling out on the police radio system, individual Tijuana municipal police by name, and say, hey, Pablo, hey, Juan, hey, Lalo, Eduardo, we're going to be operating here. And by the way, how is your wife and your two lovely daughters? Send the implicit threat that if you interfere, they will conduct violent act against the family of the cops. They kill cops. They assassinate cops. They kill mayors. But how do they get the skills? They buy them. They co-opt them. There was a case just reported last year. A Texas state trooper, so remember the Texas Department of Public Safety, 36-year-old guy. He joined the Texas DPS in 2015. His father was the head of a cartel. He joined the cartel. He was a member of the cartel. He joined the Texas Department of Public Safety, the Highway Patrol, with the explicit interest in infiltrating that organization and gaining information that would benefit the cartel, which tells me that there's an insider threat, there's a counterintelligence threat, and our counterintelligence capability domestically is not where I'd like it to be. Our operational security capability is not where I'd like it to be. And we certainly have an integrity and internal affairs threat. So those things come together. The financial side, we're talking about nearly $3 trillion of business. Is violence how they do bulk of their business? No, the bulk of their business is influence peddling, corruption operations, the fentanyl trade. Fentanyl's incredibly toxic. It's like spreading throughout the world. In Mexico, people will say, well, we don't use fentanyl here. It's a North American problem, meaning us. And I'm like, well, no, I think we do use fentanyl there. They just don't report it well. And we get into this us versus them. It's your fault because you buy our drugs, and it's your fault because you sell us your weapons. And I'm like, well, you make it and then you use them. We're both in this. So we need a bilateral capability to deal with it. Creating the big giant wall you can't transcend is going to hurt both of us, because Mexico and the United States are economically linked and have been since the beginning of both republics. The border zone in between, I call it the hyper border because of how connected they are. That area, like 30 miles, but where the customs border, patrol settings are, so pick any border, just around Camp Pendleton, you'll see on the California side, you'll see where the selections are. When you get down in South Texas, if you go between like Corpus Christi, Houston, or San Antonio, those areas, you'll see them as well. That zone in there is worth like a third of the economic capability of both countries. The GDP of both countries, 30% of it's in that area. So if you kill it, you kill both countries. So you have to figure out how to effectively protect it, how you create a safe border. Like I did field work in the Juarez Valley, and the cartels up there, they cleaned out all the, the farmers, all the ranchers, all the people who had legitimate business, so they could get clear lines of sight, lines of communication to go across, not the big border crossings, but the smaller ones. And by the way, most of the drugs that come across go through the big ones, because all they do is they pay off somebody there and say, hey, we come, or they sacrifice a load, like old TV movies, Miami Vice, think of it. We're going to send 3 loads through, and we're going to tell the Border Patrol one's coming. They stop the one, and everybody's busy with the huge one, and there's more. So that's why you need intelligence. We need to figure out.
I've done some work looking into the border too, and it's interesting because you have to have a certain kind of person willing to go on the U.S. side, work the border. Like, hey, you're going to live in this trailer. You know, we think about San Antonio being near the border; it's hundreds of miles away, right?
Well,
And so,
yeah,
these guys are so far away that they are exposed. And it's a lot like Afghanistan, where you can call and be like, "Hey, we need help," and they're like, "I had no help coming. You're going to have to deal with this on your own." And so you're talking about a very small, sometimes single person or two people that are dealing with a threat when it comes there. And I don't care what country you're from, you're just trying to survive the day. And so we
sure.
lose track of how isolated these guys can be.
Well, yes, and I have great respect for people who I did urban policing primarily. L.A. County, the largest county, largest sheriff's department in the
Mhm.
in the country. I have great respect for people who do rural policing, where I could have a helicopter and 20 radio cars in 3 minutes, maybe
Right.
in the worst case 10 minutes. You're out there in some places. Like I was out in parts of Australia in the outback, and well, first of all, their radio don't work. They have a satellite,
Right.
command, and it comes up, and their backups coming in by plane. You know,
Oh yeah.
so
Tomorrow.
yeah, yeah. So you have to be aware. You have to work with your partners well. You have to
Mhm.
coordinate, and those are all key skills. The Border Patrol does with the resources they have a great job. They need more capability.
Right.
They need to grow, and that's not just for the United States; it's other places as well. And then you have to. The other thing to keep in mind is when you secure one area, it's like the balloon theory. So I secure the border crossing at I don't know, well, let's say El Paso, right?
Okay.
Or I secure that. So what do they do? They're going to go down, to the next crossing, or they're going to go over into Arizona because that's not protected as well. All right, or we're going to go. For me, the big ticket. There's like two major border crossings, three major border crossings coming from Baja into California. Um, Once you secure one, are they going to go to the other? Yeah. Can you secure all three at various points of time? You try. But once you secure the land border, where are they going to come? They're going to come through the sea. They're going to send pongas up. So now you
Yeah.
have a littoral capability. I often
That's true.
no, I mean you have to. So you bring in the Coast Guard, right? And you bring in
Yeah, absolutely.
so it's complex. And I spent
Right.
40 years in the national security law enforcement arenas doing various things. And I can tell you there's a little bit of bureaucratic competition between all three levels of government and within the same level of government, and believe it or not, within the same organization. Because the narco guys compete with the gang guys, compete with the counterterrorism guys, and everybody competes with the intelligence guys, even though they're ones supposedly, hopefully working with each. Command at many layers doesn't know how to do this. For me, the intelligence to understand like the fentanyl trade. 75% of
Mm.
the fentanyl coming into the United States comes across that Baja California corridor. Much of it winds up in Los Angeles and then is disseminated elsewhere. And why is that? Well, LA is a big population area, plus you have the ability to do money laundering. Most cops that work narco aren't really interested in money laundering. You don't kick down a lot of doors when you're going through those financial files,
Nope.
but you want to hurt the organization. You could steal their. You could. I don't want to say steal. That's not the right term. That's a little too colloquial. You could seize their drugs all day long. There's more to come. If you inhibit their financial flows, you can constrain that organization. So we need to
Mm.
train cops in how to do financial crimes and global financial crimes. And money laundering takes many forms. Like LA becomes important because you have bars, you have tire stores, you have the fashion trade, you have real estate,
Yeah.
right? So the Chinese, and this is one that I wanted to remember before we close, Chinese organized crime is involved in the trade of fentanyl, the precursors, and the product from China to three places. And so precursor, finished product. China across the Pacific to Mexico. Some of it
Yeah.
stays in Mexico. The Mexican officials often are reticent to say so, but some stays and creates a market there, and over time that grows. Some comes to the United States. Some comes direct to the United States, and that tends to go into Northern California, the San Francisco area, and then some of it, stays, and then the rest is distributed throughout the United States. Some of it goes to Canada. And when it goes to Canada, it tends to go to Vancouver because that's where flows of migration brought Chinese nationals back when, starting when the Hong Kong shifted from being a British colony to becoming a special administrative region. And so you get some of the product stays in Canada, some of it moves into the United States. So you have multiple vectors. There's a new vector coming because we start to interdict that relatively well. Not as well as we'd like, because there's an awful lot of it, and the ocean and the borders are huge, vast areas. They're moving some of it into India, and from India across to Mexico, etc. So they're always going to adapt. It's a little bit like spy versus spy. That's why, again, you need intelligence, you need counterintelligence. Yep. They need to be wedded. Who is the domestic counterintelligence organization in the United States? That's somewhat of a rhetorical question. I mean, the FBI.
Yeah. Right.
But when you think of domestic intelligence inside the United States, is that a pure federal function? The answer is no. The 10th Amendment means the bulk of the police power of the United States domestically is invested in 50 states, and in many states that's devolved down into municipal police or county sheriffs, et cetera, et cetera. And when we put task forces together, and task forces are part of the operational answer to this, how do you configure it? How many of the task force guys are trained in depth in counterintelligence? Not as many as I would like. I mean, I've certainly worked with guys that were and have been, and in every organization I know, premier stellar cops, stellar crime analysts, stellar intelligence officers, but you have to bring that to an entire organization. So
it's not as easy as that even too, because when you get there to that task force or whatever it is, are you any good? And like in my field, counterintelligence, there's 150 jobs, right? And so your last job might have been sweeping for bugs in Germany, whatever it is. And you get there, you're like, wait, we're doing a whole new thing. You might be capable, but are you professional grade? Probably not. It's hard to get a counterintelligence agent up to speed in different things. Go ahead.
No, it takes time. When I ran, you may recall, I was one of the co-founders of the Los Angeles Terrorism Early Warning Group. And I would say it takes the military to get a special force, say if you're in the Army, a special forces field grade officer. Well, what gets you there? Like, to be really proficient, 15 years?
Right. Yeah.
Right? So I tell my boss, he says, hey, John, how long is it going to take for our intelligence capability to be good? I'm like, well, I know it takes 15 years to train a guy. I've got some people with good training. I've got guys on my cadre that are reserves. Some were senior NCOs. Some are officers. Some have prior experience. 5 years I get us a minimal capability. It's like, you can't say that.
5 years.
I'm like, I just told you the reality. I mean, and that's what's pushing hard with budget, assuming you're going to allow me to choose the people that I need and then send them to training.
Yeah.
Now, so it takes a lot. I see there's a question about how involved is Iran in helping these organizations learn bomb making. You know what? That gets into something that's a little difficult to say in general. I will say that all terrorist organizations share bomb making capability that some nation states like China, Russia, and Iran, Venezuela, if that's still a nation state, because it's kind of nearing that state implosion capability, they influence to a degree. Some of these guys learn it the way we do. They experiment. I remember I gave a briefing one day in Reno, and I'm talking about chemical biological agents, and in the audience was a guy who was arrested by the FBI as part of an anthrax investigation, and I'm looking, saying, "Wow, this is unclass." They go to class, they learn. You see, bomb makers. I used to watch the video. I don't trust bomb makers missing fingers, but many of them do, right? So there are the hybrid threat component of this is real. It's underestimated. I mentioned the main players. they leverage organized crime as a way to destabilize states. And they do so actively. They share information in real time, not only just on the dark, web, which of course is there. They do it in the open web too, right? I mean, there's so much that you have to find it. So, how did they come together? The point I want to make with the Chinese, they're moving fentanyl. They're part of the trade. They figure out that they're good at money laundering. They get to Los Angeles and start money laundering there. And then now we decided to legalize the production of cannabis in California. But the proposition being we will cut the violence. Well, whether cannabis or any other drug is legal or, sanctioned is a separate question from are we going to be able to limit organized crime? Because if you look at prohibition as an example, well, when we legalized alcohol once again, the mafia didn't go away. They stayed. Well, organized crime is always penetrating legitimate business. So the Chinese are here. They decide, well, there's this gray market for cannabis. Let's get in that. So they're starting to buy the grows, and not just in California, but in like Oregon and Oklahoma. There was an actual excellent article came out a couple of days ago in ProPublica about the Oklahoma piece of this. And they're starting to do vertical integration. So they're doing the grows, they're doing the money laundering, and they're doing human trafficking. So they're bringing people across the border. So migrant smuggling, but they also do human trafficking and migrant smuggling, a little distinction between what the purpose of the moving the person across the frontier is. And then they will bring them to the grow, and they cause them to work as virtual slaves. It's like you owe your life to the company store. You're always going to be able to buy yourself out, except you can never quite get out, right? So that's just an example of how these things are totally integrated, except they're integrated globally. Crime and war blur, so you need to have capabilities to deal with low intensity conflict, deal with civil policing, and then deal with the interface within. And that takes 15 years to train a special forces officer. Well, I think it takes probably about that time. Looking back at my career in law enforcement, 15 years, I was a sergeant. I was thinking I was getting pretty proficient. But you're assigned to the border. You're assigned to patrol Union Station. You're assigned to an airport. Well, just because you're on week 6 off training doesn't mean you're not going to be the first into the big incident, right? If you're a brand new detective, that doesn't mean that you're not going to catch the complex case. Well, you have to build and capability and train in multiple areas. So I would say I had people that were investigators, and they're great investigators. I had analysts that were great analysts. You need to get them to work together, and I would start to cross-train them. Right? Guys that were really good intel guys and guys that were really good ops guys, but start to cross-train them. And we talk about intelligence fusion, which I personally don't think we fully understand what that means, because we think it's a place, not a process. I would tell you that fusion occurs at every step of the intelligence cycle, not just in some room separate from everybody else. And that if I fuse it in the center and I send it to you as an operational commander, well, you got to understand what I sent you. And then your subordinate leaders, your staff has to figure out how to make sense of it and then turn that into like tactical intelligence, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's
so are we
so hard.
Are we configured to do this? And
no, because if you're getting great information down, so the ops guy can go, here's how I'm going to gather on this particular thing that we're doing. If you've got good agents on the ground, tactical guys like me, I'm busy. I don't have time for that. And I don't know what the vision is. And I'm too far removed from that idea on what might be generated. And I'm like, I am busy dealing with warlords, murderers, and I'm trying to stay alive. And look, I got no shortage of reports to write, right? And so that capability, it's really hard to develop. But I don't want to interrupt on you with that, but I don't know if people understand how hard it is to go into the wild and develop trust with people that are competing life and death against your bureaucracy.
Sure. Well, I personally do. The question is, The question is, do our higher commands understand?
Yeah,
And
and
then,
how does the liaison piece work? Because you could be working with DOE, Coast Guard, FBI, Army, CI. I mean, all these different sub CI elements, and that's just counterintelligence. Throw in everything else. Who's managing the dozens of organizations that have to cooperate or at least liaise to get things done?
you know, it varies from department to department, city to city, and I can tell you from time to time. When I was, and I've been retired for 5 years now, going on 6.
Yeah,
When I was still active, I had myself and I created a team, tactical liaison team of people that I trusted, trained, and was confident if I sent them off to do something, they wouldn't embarrass me. Right. And
right.
my standard was if you were going to be one of my LNOs, liaison officers, and you were going to go out with a tier 1 force, was if you could do a good MET T, that would be my measure of success. Right.
Right.
Because teams they were going to work with would be comfortable to work with them, which meant you couldn't just give them a PowerPoint slide, train to train across, and you're ready to go. It meant you had to do iterative training over time, reinforced by exercises, growing in complexity over time, and then train and exercise with all those entities. See, because the first time is not enough, right? You have to learn each other. You have to have. See, we try to develop intelligence analysts because that's the easiest, and that's good. Well, it takes an analyst a lot of time to get there. If you get a good analyst at, say, NSA or CIA, they've been there for 20, 30 years, and they're working Afghanistan. They know Afghanistan in and out. And then you have somebody next to them that knows like Persia and Iran, and somebody who works Africa. And then you start to do the transnational network piece. There's not a lot of those, but you need to bring all those together, work them together, reinforce the commonality, and then as a commander, and you need. In the civil side, we don't have CW5s who stayed their entire career in their specialty and know it in and out. Right. So I'm not going to grab. I won't mention them by name, but I'm not going to grab an SF CW5 and know that he's going to tell the commanding general what needs to be known at the right time. Because who is that in NYPD? There is probably one guy there. Who is that in LAPD? But we tend to rotate commanders right every 3 years, right? You get your command 3 years, you're up or out, or you're moving lateral, and if it takes you 15 years, how do you get that continuity? How do you do it among enterprises? Because I told a former boss of mine not too long ago that we were better at dealing with these issues with the FBI before 9/11.
Yeah. There's also a thing with if you're a commander of guys, you need a giant ass that can be chewed on, because I'm going to make mistakes. My job is too hard to be perfect. I'm going to do dumb things that in retrospect are dumb. I'm going to miss things that I shouldn't have missed, because the dude on the ground has the hardest, dangerous job. And it's so complex. You can't do it all. And you can't work enough hours in the day to get that done. And I need to know that John is going to protect me. Otherwise, who knows what happens to my whole life, and that's a big piece. And it's hard to communicate that to the guy on the ground in the moment when you're talking to someone who just fed someone to a dog.
No, it's hard, but there's a couple of ways. I mean, this could be a whole another discussion, but you have to create a command climate that allows your subordinate leaders and your operators to be able to function efficiently and function within the rules of law, right? I mean, you can't go out and break the law to enforce the law, although I believe that's been done from time to time. You can't commit war crimes and expect to create legitimacy in the population that you're trying to protect, right? So you have to train people at a high level. I personally think, and I've supervised thousands of people over the years, I personally think 98.9% of cops mean to be good cops. Some cross the line. There's always somebody who's going to, but the ones who cross the line, in my experience, and you have to discipline your subordinates, because that's part of it, or a whole place goes out of control. Part of protecting them is disciplining them, and disciplining them early before it becomes a fatal mistake, a career killer.
Right.
So you have to monitor your personnel. You have to know them. And if you're a commander, how do you do that? Well, you don't do it by going to your office, shutting the door, and talking to the boss at the next job you want to get to. You get there by going walking the ground, talking to the men and women that are going to get you there, right?
Yeah.
Or ensure that you can't get there one way or another. Because if you're not an effective commander, although I've seen one or two get promoted, if you're not an effective commander, you're not going to go too far over time because it will show. So it's complicated. It's complicated between organizations. You have to build trust. You have to build at the national level. How many committees in Congress have oversight over the issues we just talked about, ranging from terrorism to organized crime? 154?
Yeah.
You know, and so you can't talk to all those members of the staff at the same level. If you're good, you talk to as many as you can. But you start to learn how to get there, start to learn how to influence. But I think first we have to revitalize the domestic intelligence infrastructure in the United States and create strong links with the foreign intelligence and our allies, at least the Five Eyes, because, you know, Mexican cartels operate in Australia, right?
Yeah.
You know, they operate in Europe. You know, it's like, I used to ask a question to young analysts. How did a stolen car from Los Angeles wind up as a car bomb in Iraq? And I know it got there by ship, but you know, but the rhetorical question was, well, how did that happen? What are the routes? What are the flows? Who are the enablers? Because it's not just the criminal organizations, it's the enablers that do that. Who are the foreign intelligence officers from which nations engaged in this? You know, and they turn up here. I know they do. Are we configured to deal with it? No. Are we configured to know? Because a lot of cops, when they look at this, they want information from the high side, as if they're going to teleport the information you need just magically to you standing on a corner in Compton on Saturday night, you know, at 10 p.m. That's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
How do you get that information both ways? How do you get it laterally? Because say I'm the commander of, you know, pick any precinct in New York, right? I'm interested in my precinct, right? Unless I got to go that and they're going to make me worry about it. Take a police chief in the San Gabriel Valley or a sheriff's captain in the San Gabriel Valley. Do they know what that adjoining jurisdiction is up to and what are they doing? Do they know that the gangsters in their neighborhood are linked to gangsters in Las Vegas and that their common supply chain is like, you know, this Sinaloa cartel or the Chinese or some mix thereof? And so you've hit it. There's a concern about what's happening in the neighborhood. There's a concern about getting home at night. There's a concern about protecting your public. I want to make this arrest. I don't have time to write the report. Well, you know what? The report's worth more than the arrest in some cases. Because that creates the information seam you need to put together your organization. Because in my mind, a detailed social network analysis of the organization and looking at where their centers of gravity are, decisive points in their flow might be where I'm going to target. And it may not be the top guy, because I'm still not convinced that Chapo Guzman was actually ever really fully running the Sinaloa cartel. He was one of a constellation, and we're seeing that break down now because that entire ecosystem is fragile. And when it breaks down, then it tends to become more violent here. And it's connected here. See, because it's cheaper to create alliances and more profitable to create alliances than to try to do a hostile takeover.
Yeah.
You know,
no, for sure.
So how do you get
one of the
notice?
You had said earlier, you talked about the Five Eyes, and here's the thing I've learned through all of my time: that as soon as someone says we'll release to the Five Eyes, someone raises their hand and like, "What about Jordan?" Like, "Oh yeah, shit, you know what? You're right." But don't forget Israel. Oh, you know what? You're right. Hey, Spain, and then all of a sudden the Five Eyes become 25 countries because how in the world are you going to cut out Indonesia? You know, like you need them.
I wouldn't right now. But you see,
well, yeah, I'm just. Yeah,
it's like a Russian.
And it depends case by case, right? But Five Eyes always becomes bigger because all the enemy has to do is move over one country, and they're like, boom, you know, infiltration, and we didn't provision Spain or whatever it's going to be. Italy, come on.
And the answer is, so it's Five Eyes plus NATO plus,
Yeah.
But I mean,
Yeah.
I say it's like a Russian doll, not because there's a Russian doll threat, because there is that too. Because everything you
Yeah.
say on your side, your adversaries have, and we often make the mistake of thinking that they're less sophisticated because their cultural reference points are different than ours. The first Sinaloa cartel member I met was like in 1988 in South Los Angeles, and I
Yeah.
truthfully thought he was goofy because he had a cowboy hat on and his truck had a Brahma Bull. He just happened to have like weapons and a lot of like
Yeah.
cocaine in the car. And little did I realize how the Sinaloa Federation became a major multinational conglomerate, to use an analogy, and battling with others. So we need to not mirror image. We need to build capability. We need to realize it's all coalition operations.
Yeah.
Coalition operations are all building trust. And even between your different organizations in your own agency, or between the FBI and the LAPD and the sheriff, or NYPD and the Port Authority police and the FBI, or between the CI task force and the counterterrorism task force and the HIDA guys, because they're different guys, right? And there's a link between crime and terrorism. But if you don't work it together, you can't see. So you're right. It's an ongoing evolution. That's why my concept, I borrowed the concept from the Marine Corps, but a tactical liaison team of people I would put together with different specialties who could go in and work with others and be able to create the optimal exchange of information and operational capability between the two. When I talked to the NATO guys, I just recently took the targeting class for the legal advisors, and I'm like, yeah, you need an Anglico or an air naval gunfire liaison group, right? And that's not a term that the British Army uses, but they know that. But they know the idea. And we don't target, the civil population in the country I police. We target criminals for prosecution, but the same concept. Right. I've run into one, and I tend to call it the operational space as opposed to the battle space, because it works better with political leaders. And I've had them tell me that directly. The first time I told them I was doing intelligence preparation of the battlefield in LA County.
Whoa.
Yeah. So the ops space, but that may work better, because if you look at hybrid operations and hybrid warfare, which I think is something that we should be concerned with, even as we calibrate for large-scale combat operations. And I don't want to do the large-scale combat operations with our likely adversaries, because I don't, it's going to take some effort to get there. But all of this that we're talking about is going to be part of it. So there's new capability we need. There's political support we need. We need to create command environments that allow our subordinate leaders and operators to be able to function well. We need to root out corruption, because there are good cops in Mexico. There are good cops in Brazil. I've worked with them. There are good military operators down there. Corruption tentacles reach out and capture people, and they go here too, because I've seen that happen.
I just got a couple things for you real fast, and we'll wrap it up because it's been a little over an hour. But one of the other capabilities that we often miss because we're in America and we're working internationally is the fact that religion is part of a lot of these people's lives and how they run themselves. And I learned that working in Afghanistan. We had a Jordanian colonel who's attached to us. This guy ranks equal with our commander. We couldn't treat that Jordanian colonel with any respect as an international partner or an army partner. Now, I knew to do that because I'd been around enough. But this guy, like our colonel says to that colonel, he's like, here is a PSD for you so you can run around the battlefield and do whatever you need to do. And he let him loose, right? We all, as an organization, couldn't see that. And then when I started talking to my buddy Rich, I started talking to him, we understood how he was using religion to help stabilize the region that we were in. And again, we couldn't be bothered, right? And so you have these things where that multicultural aspect of the operation is huge, because even if you know everything about Mexico, there's going to be those sub things that the Mexican cartel adversary is going to know that you'll never know. And then the last thing I want to have you fill in, because before we wrap up, is I like to give the big knob, the big switch to a guy like you and say, okay, so you're going to talk to President Biden or President next. Let's just say whoever that's going to be. What's your one thing that you get to change that we don't have now, or we need more of or less of, or whatever it is? So hit those 2 points, and I'll get out of your way.
Well, that can't give me an easy question, huh? The first thing I'd say is that cultural dimensions of conflict, to include religion, are vitally important. And if you look at how you influence populations, they can become stabilizing capabilities if used properly. The U.S. Institute of Peace has done a lot of good work on training on how to do that. If you do it wrong, you can exacerbate the conflict and
sure.
And so that's hard. So I think you need to look at all those areas because there's always a potential for creating radicalization. And if you don't try to your influence operation properly, you can accelerate radicalization and accelerate the conflict. So you need to be aware of that. I would say you need to have a team to include sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, and people who are just good at command. And
right,
that's variable, but there's certainly, senior command NCOs that are good at that. There's certainly, officers that are good at that. I'd bring those folks into that process and consider that. Know that religion can be a positive to keep people exit violence, or it can be used, and the cartels use it, to be able to extract resources and create justification for their operations. So it goes both ways. So I would call what you need to do there forensic theology. Who are they? What are they talking about? What does it mean now? And how does it vary over time? Avoid mirror imaging. What's the one thing I would tell the president? Create a more agile, adaptive national intelligence council capability to be able to deal with converging threats, because we can't go serially one threat at a time in the world we live in now, but our bureaucracies prefer that.
Yeah, they sure do. It's easier. It's easier, right? Yeah.
It's easier.
I will listen.
Go
ahead.
And the last thing is that adaptive capability for converging threats has to bridge domestic and foreign while respecting constitutional protections. And that's not an easy task, but I don't believe it's an impossible task.
Yeah. Man, I appreciate your time. I had you already an hour and 10 minutes almost. I don't want to take any more of it, but let's just do another one soon and continue to talk about this. We talked about the complexity this time. Maybe next time we'll dive in on some specific things. Yeah, because, there are command issues that come together, how you do this. There are analytical issues about how you create the optimal analysis. There are certainly, the entire tactical liaison piece, that's an art. Some people are good at it. Yeah. I think from time to time I have been good at it. But you're right. How do you create that beyond your command transition? How do you get it so that organization doesn't, as it does, they do go through peaks and valleys? Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, let me run these credits. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll be right back to you, John. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.